My name is Alyssa Robinson, and I am the digital strategist here at Trietsch, and I am talking to our senior pastor, Reverend Daniel Humbert. And this is Go Beyond, where we continue to dig into our message from Sunday. On Monday, we talked about the context behind Scripture, and we were focusing on Ruth. And today is my favorite day where I get to challenge the message, and I really get to push Daniel and ask some tough questions. So I'm really excited about that. I don't know if Daniel is.
I will try to be.
Great, fantastic. So the first question that I have, everything that we talked about on Sunday was about trusting in God. And so I want to know, what does it look like to trust in God? Because you said that Ruth trusted God, but after reading through the story, it seems like she and Naomi put in a ton of work to shape their own future. And that doesn't feel like trusting in God to me. So when you say that she trusted, what do you mean?
Yeah, well, trust is an interesting deal, right? Because trust, basically, if I trust somebody, it means I'm willing to let them do pretty much anything because I trust whatever they say they're going to do, or I trust who they are as a person. I trust that that they are the kind of person that they claim to be. So if I trust somebody, whoever it is, I am willing to let them, interface with my life. I'm willing to let them do pretty much what they say they're going to do because I trust that it's true, right? For instance, initiated a task force here 3 weeks ago, and I didn't participate because I trusted everybody on the group to do what I wanted them to do, or that is to say, what I asked them to do. And so I trusted them. Well, so if I trust God, then it means I'm willing to let God do whatever God's going to do. It doesn't mean I trust that God's going to perfect my life or make everything turn out all right or make everything just the way I wanted it. But rather, for me, what it means to trust is I'm willing to accept whatever may come. I'm willing to accept whatever God might put into place. I'm willing to believe that God has a better outcome or a better way forward than I might have on my own. And so even though clearly, as you point out, Ruth and Naomi kind of, they put things into place themselves, they work some stuff out themselves. I believe from the very beginning, when Ruth says, I'm going to go where you go, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, I believe she placed trust in whatever was going to happen down the road. She didn't have a clue she was going to meet Boaz. She didn't have a clue she was going to be able to glean from his field. She didn't have a clue that there was as the language goes, that there would be this kinsman redeemer. What she was willing to do was to trust God with whatever that future looked like. Now, as they got back to Bethlehem and as they got into their lives, sure, they began to do things that I think any of us might do, which is, I need to eat. I think I'm going to need to glean. It would be helpful for me to have a husband in the time of the day. And so I'm going to figure out a way to try to move towards that. But I think ultimately, Ruth was willing to just put it in God's hands, however it was going to turn out, whether or not she married Boaz, whether or not she was going to have a future. Her trust was, I believe God's got this, and however it turns out, I'm willing to live into that. That's what I mean.
Okay, and I also, I don't know, I struggle with that personally because
Sure.
I struggle with trust. And so when I look at how much Ruth and Naomi, the way I would interpret it was manipulating the situation to make sure she got put in front of Boaz, in front of the right people, that to me feels like taking things into your own hands. And I think that one of the things that I struggle with in trust is, and it applies to COVID too, is this idea of just like, let go and let God, you don't need to plan for the future. Don't worry about it. God's got this. It's all going to be taken care of. And I hate that mindset. That doesn't feel like trust to me.
Yeah, no, I get that. And again, what I do not mean by trust is that we trust that God's just going to work it out, if you will, that somehow it's all going to work out the way I want or the way I think it should be, but rather the trust factor is, am I willing to accept whatever comes? Whether it works out great and everything I hope for, or whether, golly, it feels like crap, but I'm willing to just live into that or accept that, or willing to know that that's may not have been what I hoped for, but it's still going to be all right. That somehow God's got, when I say God's got this, all I mean is God's with me and God's for me. That's all I mean. I don't mean God that God's controlling the moment so much as I believe God is with me and for me, and I'll be all right. This will be all right, even though it may not be what I'd hoped for. I mean, for instance, you say, and certainly towards the end, Ruth kind of, clearly was working towards a relationship with Boaz, but initially she didn't have a clue. When she went out gleaning that first time, she didn't know whose field that was. She didn't know that he was related to Naomi. Now, eventually she did, obviously, but when she first went out, she didn't know who that was. All she knew was she needed food. She was hungry, and they needed to take care of themselves. And it kind of worked out that it happened to be Boaz's land, and golly, he's related to Naomi, and man, this is going to work. And so it was at that point that now she's willing to figure, golly, I think I'll kind of step in line here and try to make something work out.
Well, and that kind of brings up that idea of positivity. So one of the first points that you gave on Sunday of how to trust God is to stay positive. And what is the difference between being positive and being optimistic? Do you see that as two different things?
I don't personally. Ultimately, what I meant by stay positive was, and certainly in the language of faith, remain hopeful, remain hopeful that things will somehow be all right. I mean, as opposed to gloom and doom, woe is me, nothing's ever going to work, this will never pan out. It's easy to go down that rabbit trail because stuff is not working out the way all of us would want COVID stuff to be gone now, right? And it's easy to think, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get back to work, or I'm never going to be able to have my own personal time, or I'm never going to be able to go on vacation, or I'm never going to have my life back. It's really easy to go down that road. All I mean by positive is don't let that negative stuff grab hold and take off. It's perfectly fine to be realistic. That is to say, man, I wish I didn't have to do all my work out of the house, or I wish I could go to my restaurants that I really like all the time. That's realistic, right? And that's an acknowledgement of my feelings and my thoughts. We don't ever want to deny that. We don't ever want to ignore that. But what we do want to be is, well, how can I make the best of this? And how can I figure out a way to not let doom and gloom take over, but rather be hopeful that something's going to work out eventually, right? That's all I meant by being positive.
Okay. And so that I would define as optimism. And to me, positivity and optimism do feel like different things, because being optimistic seems more future driven, of things will eventually work out in the end, and everything's going to be okay. And positivity to me is about attitude in the moment.
Yeah.
Don't let this overcome you. And I think it's actually more valuable to be positive than to be optimistic, because we don't know that we can be hopeful that things will work out well, but we don't know that it will.
That's
not
right.
To be bleak.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that's really what I did mean by positive is you've got to keep upbeat even while being a realist. Do I like all this stuff? No, that's real. Am I having fun with all this? No, that's real. But to be positive about how you can keep going, I think is ultimately important, because as you point out, the attitude is very helpful. And that's when I identify Ruth's positivity, I identify that she was grateful for what she encountered in Boaz's field. She was then grateful specifically to him when she said, Ellie, you don't have to treat me this well. I'm an immigrant, right? I'm a foreigner. You don't have to do this. And so she was acknowledging her gratitude. And I'm very convinced that gratitude and positivity, are very connected. I think gratitude helps positivity. And I think it also ultimately leads to a hopeful a hopeful future.
Mm. Well, and on the other side of things, the negativity. So Naomi in the story, and we didn't cover this part of the story on Sunday, and I still want to recommend to people to read the 4 chapters because it's
Yep,
a
yep.
quick read and it's really interesting. But Naomi was so negative that she changed her name to Mara, meaning bitter, in the story. Um, what are we supposed to learn? I don't understand that whole transition of like, call me
Yeah.
bitter, you know?
Well, yeah. Well, so here's all I get out of that. I don't think Naomi changed her name. She says, call me Mara, which I think is just a way for her to acknowledge the reality of her emotions, the reality of her circumstances, and to acknowledge that, golly, life is tough sometimes and it sure doesn't work out the way I wanted. And so I don't think she changes her name. I mean, you notice throughout the rest of the chapters, she's not called Mara, she's called Naomi. And so for me, what I learned from Naomi is, man, it's all right to be real. It's all right to be human. It's all right to acknowledge my grief, my sorrow, my sadness, in her case, bitterness. But I don't even think she was calling herself bitter so much as she was just acknowledging, man, I've had a bitter pill to swallow. I've lost my husband. I've lost my 2 sons. And the reality is, at least in the moment that she's referring to, I've lost my homeland and my country, and I want to go back. I want to get back into that. And so for me, what I take from Naomi is not that that's permanent, but that it is needful, that I acknowledge my human sadness and my emotion that in the time is it kind of stinks, because it does. That's what I take from Naomi. I don't consider it permanent at all. I mean, I find Naomi's attitudes once we get into chapter 3 and 4 as very positive and trying to help Ruth. So that's why I take it not so much as a permanent change to bitter, but rather just a temporary acknowledgement that golly, life is every once in a while bitter.
Mm. And I also want to hit on, I have so many questions and we don't have time for all of them, but
Just 4 chapters. They're just 4 chapters.
I know. The comment that you made, or the charge almost, that clarity clutters, and that we shouldn't be seeking clarity. We should be seeking faith and trust. But where's the balance there? Because I understand we will not know everything about God's inner workings and the way that God's energy flows through this universe and how it's impacting everything. But at the same time, our gift of being visionary and planning for the future, and I believe is a gift from God. So what do you mean by clarity clutters? Because it almost sounds like, don't plan for the future. Don't worry about it. Get the clutter out of there. But I don't think I agree with that.
Well, so cut me a little slack here. The message is about how do we face the giant of uncertainty? And so I'm not saying clarity clutters all the time, but when we find ourselves in uncertain times, when things are not making sense and we're not quite sure, what's on the other side of this, and obviously in the context specifically of COVID-19, when we're in uncertain times, we should not always be looking for, well, so on what date will I be able to make this happen so that I can then do this so that that will then take place, right? That's what I mean by clarity clutters. When we're looking for that specific thing and we can't quite get there, it's causing a problem. And if you're like me and you've got OCD tendencies, it causes a lot more problems, because if I can't get to that one thing, then man, I start spinning out of control because I want that one thing, right? So that's what I'm talking about really, is in the context of uncertainty, we can't let clarity be the defining factor. Now, as regards to vision, I think it's real important that, and I think most people who are visionary folks would own this, vision is clearly important in moving towards a future and casting a vision so that we can get there. But I think almost any visionary would say to you, I clearly as a vision, I mean, that's a part of my job as vision casting. I can cast a vision without having all the details in place. I can cast a vision without knowing literally how we're going to get there, right? And so that too is about clarity clutters. And all I mean there is, excuse me, is it's possible to know I want to get there, whatever point B is. I can get there without knowing all the specific details. And if I have to have all the specific details in order to get there, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to either quit, give up, or turn back because I don't have all the details. So that's where this trust factor comes in of just owning, I'm going to do my part. I'm going to figure out what I can figure out. And then I'm going to trust for the gap between the two, because I may not have all the detail or all the information, but I'm going to trust the gap measure there, that God's somehow going to figure that out, right? And so I think for most vision casters, that's the reality of the day. I frequently cast a vision that I have no clue how we're going to get there, right? I just believe we're going to get there. I trust that we can get there, but I don't have all the details. I don't have all the clarity yet. So that's what
it's more about letting go of the absolutes and taking, because it feels like when we're putting those absolutes in place of like, we're going to do this on this date and there is no flexibility around it, we're creating almost, handcuffs for ourselves of, we're stuck in this and there's no way out of it. And that takes away your hope because you feel stuck.
Right. And so just as a simple, for instance, one of the largest vision castings that it happened in my lifetime, it was before you were born, but when John F. Kennedy said, we will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, he had some parameters, right? The moon, a person, and the end of the decade. And that's all the detail he gave. But that was such a powerful vision that everybody could buy into it. Everybody believed, man, we can make this happen. We can get this done. And how cool will it be when we put a person on the moon? But he just had 3 parameters: a person, the moon, and by the end of the decade. He didn't choose a specific date, a specific year, a specific month, right? I mean, it was just 3 simple things, and they made it happen.
So going away from directly commenting on scripture and going to you personally. So Ruth denied or walked away from her faith, her family, her traditions, everything to be able to follow Naomi with absolutely no idea what was coming next because she wanted to be there and care for her. Have you ever gone against your family, your traditions, your religion, whatever it is, for the sake of following God's purpose for you?
Yeah, man, that's a tough question that I don't really know that I have a full answer for. I certainly believe that I've never lost or left my religion in order to follow God, because of course I believe that's, what my religion calls me to do. But I would say kind of in small ways, I guess, small ways of leaving either family and or traditions in order to do what I believe was right. According to God. And that might be anything from literal missing family events in order to do something that I believe was really faithful to God, or changing how I viewed, or how I was taught, rather, to view other human beings. I grew up in a pretty racist household, and not horribly, but just clear. And I remember even as a child thinking, man, I don't think I agree with that, Dad, or I don't think I understand why you're being that way, Dad. And I, of course, didn't say those words because I was a kid. But as I became an adult and could make more of my own choices, and I began to recognize how evil racism is, then I began to sort of leave more and more clearly those customs or cultural mores or whatever you want to call them, that said this kind of person's less than, this kind of person doesn't deserve. And so I guess in that regard, yeah, I have. And you just sort of have to trust, right? My white privilege has allowed me so many opportunities that I never realized until I got to seminary how privileged my life was. And not that privilege is a bad thing in and of itself, but when I chose at the time, when I was choosing not to do anything about that or not to use that privilege to help make a difference in other people's lives, that's when I began to realize I've got to do something with this privilege to help other people out. Yeah.
Well, that's about all that we have time for, but I just find it amazing that in 4 chapters of the Bible, we can have so much deep, meaningful
Yeah.
conversation. And I'm just excited for what we will continue to discover and go beyond. So I just want to encourage everybody to join us again on Friday and hopefully we'll be live. If this happens again, we'll figure something out,
That's
but
right.
we're going to walk you through a spiritual practice that aligns with our theme this week of facing uncertainty, and from the book of Ruth. So
Absolutely. Will be fun, and we will be live. Let's make sure that we're going to trust that that's true.
we're going to trust that will happen. Have a good day, everybody.